Imagine this. You're 73 years old, sitting across from your adult daughter who's asking you to babysit her children for the 5th time this month. Your back aches, your energy is depleted, and you had plans to finally read that book you've been postponing for months. Yet the word no feels like it's trapped behind an invisible wall in your throat. You hear yourself saying, "Of course, dear," while something inside you screams in protest. This isn't about being a loving grandparent. This is about a psychological prison that Sigmund Freud identified over a century ago, one that becomes more suffocating with each passing year of life. You've survived decades of experience, accumulated wisdom that younger generations desperately need, yet you find yourself as powerless as a child when it comes to this simple 2-letter word. Here's the disturbing paradox. The very people who should have the most authority over their own lives, those who've paid their dues, raised families, built careers, survived losses, are often the most enslaved by their inability to refuse. While teenagers rebel against everything, seasoned adults comply with requests that drain their souls. But why does this happen? Why do people who've mastered complex careers, navigated decades of relationships, and accumulated lifetimes of wisdom suddenly become mute when their boundaries are crossed? Why does the word no feel more forbidden than any curse word you've ever uttered? Freud discovered something revolutionary about human psychology that explains this phenomenon, and more importantly, he provided a solution that most people never learn. The inability to say no isn't a character flaw or a sign of weakness. It's a sophisticated psychological mechanism that was programmed into your unconscious mind decades ago, and it's been silently controlling your life ever since. What if I told you that every time you've said yes when you meant no, you weren't being kind or considerate? You were actually betraying the most authentic part of yourself. What if your inability to refuse is the very thing that's prevented you from experiencing the freedom and joy that should define your golden years? The answer to reclaiming your power lies not in motivation or willpower, but in understanding the hidden psychological forces that Freud uncovered. And once you see what's really happening beneath the surface, you'll never look at your relationships, or yourself, the same way again. If you're ready to discover why saying no has felt impossible, and how to break free from this invisible prison, make sure to subscribe to this channel and hit that like button. What you're about to learn will change everything you thought you knew about human psychology and your own mind. Freud made a disturbing discovery that shook the foundations of human understanding. We are not the masters of our own minds. The conscious self that you identify as you, the part that makes decisions, forms opinions, and navigates daily life, is actually just the tip of an enormous psychological iceberg. Below the surface lies the unconscious, a vast reservoir of repressed memories, forbidden desires, and most importantly, the internalized voices of every authority figure who ever held power over you. This is where your inability to say no was born. Freud identified 3 parts of the human psyche: the id, your raw desires, the ego, your conscious self, and the superego, the internalized voice of authority. But here's what most people don't understand. Your superego isn't just your conscience. It's a psychological tyrant that was programmed into you during childhood by parents, teachers, religious figures, and social institutions. Every time a parent said good children don't say no to adults, every time a teacher punished you for questioning authority, every time you were praised for being compliant and agreeable, your superego was being programmed with a fundamental rule. Your worth depends on your willingness to serve others, even at the expense of your own needs. Carl Jung, Freud's brilliant protege, expanded on this concept by identifying what he called the persona, the mask we wear to be accepted by society. For many people, especially those raised in traditional family structures, the persona became synonymous with being the good person who never refuses, never disappoints, never causes conflict. But Jung warned that living entirely through the persona leads to what he called psychological death. a state where you become so disconnected from your authentic self that you lose touch with who you really are. Friedrich Nietzsche, another profound thinker, called this phenomenon slave morality, the belief that virtue comes from self-sacrifice and submission to others' needs. He argued that this mindset creates what he termed the herd mentality, where individuals give up their power to avoid the discomfort of standing alone. For people in their later years, this creates a particularly tragic irony. Just when life should be offering the freedom to be authentic, they find themselves more enslaved than ever to the expectations of others. Arthur Schopenhauer identified the mechanism that makes this so painful: the will to live. He observed that humans have an innate drive towards self-preservation and self-expression, but society systematically crushes this drive by teaching us that our needs are less important than social harmony. When you say yes, but mean no, you're literally violating your own will to live, creating an internal conflict that manifests as anxiety, resentment, and a sense of life passing you by. But here's the most insidious part. The people who demand your compliance often aren't consciously trying to manipulate you. They're simply acting out their own unconscious patterns. Your adult children who expect endless availability, your friends who assume you'll always accommodate, your community organizations that rely on your inability to refuse, they're all unconsciously perpetuating what Freud called repetition compulsion, where unhealthy patterns get passed down through generations. The psychological roots run deeper. Freud discovered that many people develop reaction formation, a defense mechanism where they become compulsively agreeable to hide their underlying anger and resentment. If you've ever found yourself being overly nice to someone who consistently takes advantage of you, you've experienced this phenomenon. This creates a vicious cycle. The more you betray your authentic self by saying yes when you mean no, the more disconnected you become from your own emotional truth. And the more disconnected you become, the harder it is to access the natural assertiveness that would protect your boundaries. The tragedy is that this pattern often intensifies with age, just when wisdom and experience should be providing the confidence to stand in your truth. The inability to say no doesn't just affect individual moments, it systematically rewrites the story of your entire life. While you've been busy being agreeable and considerate, something far more sinister has been happening beneath the surface. Your relationships have been built on a foundation of deception, your identity has been hijacked by other people's needs, and your authentic self has been slowly suffocating in plain sight. Consider the neurological reality. Every time you say yes when you mean no, your brain experiences what neuroscientists call cognitive dissonance, a state of mental conflict that creates measurable stress responses. Your amygdala, the brain's alarm system, recognizes that you're betraying your own needs, triggering a cascade of stress hormones that your body was never designed to handle chronically. Over decades, this creates what psychologists call learned helplessness, a condition where you literally lose the ability to recognize that you have choices. The social consequences are equally devastating. Without realizing it, you've been training everyone around you to disrespect your boundaries. Your children have learned that your time and energy are infinitely available. Your friends have categorized you as the reliable one who will always sacrifice for others. Your community has labeled you as someone who doesn't have important priorities of your own. You've become what psychologists call a surrogate self, a person who exists primarily to fulfill other people's needs. But here's the most heartbreaking part. The people you've been trying to please often lose respect for you precisely because you can't say no. Freud observed that humans are unconsciously drawn to strength and authenticity, even when they consciously demand compliance. Your family members may rely on your inability to refuse, but they don't truly respect someone who has no boundaries. Your friendships become transactional rather than genuine because the relationship is built on what you provide rather than who you are. The psychological damage goes even deeper. Without the ability to say no, you lose what Viktor Frankl called your will to meaning, the sense that your life has purpose and direction. When every day is filled with obligations you didn't choose, when every relationship is defined by what others need from you, when every decision is made based on avoiding conflict rather than pursuing fulfillment, you begin to experience what existentialists call the absurd, a life that feels meaningless despite being constantly busy. This creates what psychologists identify as silent depression, a condition that's particularly common among older adults who appear functional on the surface but are slowly dying inside. You may not feel classically depressed, but you experience a persistent sense of emptiness, a feeling that life is happening to you rather than being lived by you. You wake up each morning not with anticipation for the day ahead, but with a vague sense of dread about the obligations that await you. The physical consequences are equally real. Chronic people-pleasing creates what medical professionals call allostatic load, the wear and tear on your body from constant stress. Your immune system becomes compromised, your sleep quality deteriorates, and you may develop what appears to be anxiety or depression, but is actually your body's natural response to living an inauthentic life. Perhaps most tragically, this pattern often intensifies during the very years when you should be experiencing the freedom that comes with age. Instead of becoming more authentically yourself, you become more enslaved to others' expectations. The people around you have learned to exploit your inability to refuse, often without even realizing they're doing it. They make requests with the unconscious assumption that you'll comply. They schedule their lives around your availability, and they've stopped considering whether their demands are reasonable because they know you'll never push back. This is the invisible prison that Freud identified, a psychological cage that becomes stronger with each yes that should have been a no. Here's the revolutionary truth that Freud discovered. The very mechanism that has trapped you can become the key to your liberation. But freedom requires something most people aren't willing to do. You must be willing to disappoint others in order to stop disappointing yourself. Freud's solution wasn't about positive thinking or motivation. It was about what he called making the unconscious conscious, bringing the hidden psychological programs that control your behavior into the light of awareness. The first step is recognizing that every time you automatically say yes, you're not being spontaneous or generous. You're following a script that was written decades ago by people who no longer even exist in your life. Start with what Freud called psychoanalytic observation. Begin noticing the internal dialogue that happens in the split second before you respond to a request. You'll discover that there's actually a brief moment where your authentic self surfaces and considers saying no. But then, almost immediately, a familiar voice emerges. Perhaps your mother's voice saying, "Don't be selfish," or your father's voice saying, "Family comes first," or a teacher's voice saying, "Good people don't refuse to help." This is your superego in action, and recognizing it is the first step toward freedom. Carl Jung called this process individuation, the lifelong journey of becoming who you really are rather than who you were programmed to be. But individuation requires what he called the courage to be disliked, the willingness to face the discomfort that comes when you stop being who everyone expects you to be. The practical rebellion begins with what psychologists call the pause technique. When someone makes a request, instead of automatically responding, you say, "Let me think about that and get back to you." This simple phrase creates space between the request and your response, giving your authentic self time to emerge. During this pause, ask yourself, if I had unlimited courage and self-respect, what would I choose to do? But here's where most people fail. They try to explain or justify their no. Freud observed that over-explanation is actually a form of seeking permission. You're unconsciously asking the other person to approve of your boundary. A truly free person doesn't need others to understand or agree with their choices. Your no is complete without justification. The next level of rebellion involves what Freud called transference analysis, recognizing that your relationships often recreate the power dynamics from your childhood. That demanding adult child isn't just your offspring, they're unconsciously playing the role of the authoritative parent, and you're unconsciously reverting to the compliant child. Breaking this pattern requires what psychologists call differentiation, the ability to maintain your adult self even when others are trying to trigger your childhood responses. Viktor Frankl, a Holocaust survivor who understood extreme psychological pressure, taught that between stimulus and response, there is a space. And in that space lies your freedom. Every request is a stimulus, but your response is always a choice. The people who seem to control you with their expectations actually have no power over you unless you give it to them. The most powerful rebellion is internal. Stop seeing yourself as someone who doesn't have the right to say no. This belief is an illusion created by your conditioning. You are not obligated to be available to everyone who demands your time. You are not required to sacrifice your well-being for others' convenience. You are not responsible for managing other people's emotions when you set boundaries. Friedrich Nietzsche wrote about becoming beyond good and evil, transcending the simplistic moral categories that keep people trapped in patterns of self-sacrifice. This doesn't mean becoming selfish or cruel. It means recognizing that genuine goodness includes honoring your own needs and boundaries. The ultimate rebellion is this: start saying no, not because you hate others, but because you love yourself enough to protect your authentic life. When you do this, something magical happens. The people who truly care about you will respect your boundaries, and the people who don't will reveal themselves as manipulative. Here is the most profound truth that Freud uncovered, the one that will shatter everything you thought you knew about relationships and human nature. The people who love you most want you to be able to say no to them. This seems impossible, doesn't it? After decades of believing that saying no would destroy your relationships, damage your reputation, and prove that you're selfish, this revelation feels like psychological vertigo. But consider this. Every healthy relationship requires two complete individuals, not one person and their shadow. When you can't say no, you're not offering your authentic self to the relationship. You're offering a hollow version of yourself that exists only to serve others' needs. Carl Jung discovered that what we most fear in others is often what we most need to develop in ourselves. The people in your life who seem to demand your constant availability may unconsciously be crying out for you to model the very boundaries they lack. Your inability to say no doesn't just harm you. It prevents others from learning to respect boundaries, manage their own needs, and develop into psychologically mature individuals. Consider the profound implications. When you always say yes, you rob others of the opportunity to become self-reliant. You enable their learned helplessness while creating your own. In trying to be endlessly supportive, you may actually be hindering their psychological development. Freud identified this as a form of codependency, a psychological dance where one person's compulsive giving enables another person's compulsive taking. But here's the revolutionary insight. Breaking this pattern doesn't destroy relationships. It transforms them into something real and sustainable. The deepest truth is this: your authentic self, complete with boundaries and limitations, is infinitely more valuable than your compliant self. The relationships that survive your transformation into an authentic person are the ones worth keeping. The relationships that crumble when you start honoring your own needs were never actually about you. They were about what you could provide. Arthur Schopenhauer wrote that a man can be himself only so long as he is alone. But the supreme realization goes beyond this. You can only truly connect with others when you're comfortable being alone, when you're complete within yourself, when your yes means something because your no is equally available. This is what Freud called mature love, the ability to choose relationship from a place of fullness rather than neediness. When you can say no, your yes becomes a gift rather than a compulsion. When you have boundaries, your generosity becomes genuine rather than obligatory. When you honor your own needs, your care for others becomes sustainable rather than depleting. The most powerful realization is that saying no is not the opposite of love. It's love's prerequisite. You cannot truly love others while betraying yourself. You cannot offer genuine compassion while ignoring your own needs. As you embrace this truth, you'll discover something extraordinary. The people who matter most in your life will not only accept your boundaries, they'll be relieved by them. They'll feel freed from the unconscious burden of constantly taking from someone who never refuses. The ultimate freedom isn't just the ability to say no. It's the recognition that you always had this power. Every moment of your life, you've been choosing. Even when you felt powerless, you were still making a choice. The prison you've been living in was always unlocked. Now you know the truth that Freud discovered. The word no isn't a weapon or a wall. It's a declaration of your right to exist as a complete human being. Use it wisely, use it kindly, but for the love of your own soul, use it. Your authentic life is waiting for you to claim it. The question is, are you finally ready to say no to everything that isn't truly yours, so you can say yes to the life that is? Share in the comments below. What's one situation where you've struggled to say no? How do you think your relationships might change if you started honoring your own boundaries? Subscribe to this channel and hit that like button if this video helped you see your life in a new way, because your authentic self deserves to be heard.